I recently moved from a much larger building to this smaller shop, and I'm challenged on trying to find places to put everything. So today, I'm going to be working on a project to get all my cordless tools and chargers off of one of my welding benches and mounted on a wall so it's out of the way and easy to get to.
Warning: read and follow all labels and the owner's manual.
So this is what I'm thinking for this project. Ultimately, I want to make a shelf, two shelves actually, one that holds the tools and one that holds the chargers. I want to make the shelf that holds the tools actually to have some slots in it so that I could actually take and easily remove the tools. So I'm going to take a piece for the bottom shelf and I'm going to cut however many slots in that bottom shelf. Then I'm probably going to do maybe 6 tools. I'm going to make my slots all the same distance so I don't have to keep the tools in whatever order and they'll still fit. And I'm going to make that measurement now. I'm going to overhang that a little bit, about 1 inch on each side of the tool. And so that gives me on mine about 23 inches. So I'm going to make that tool holder shelf 23 inches long, and then I'm going to lay out where I need to cut those slots. As I was thinking about this, I think what I'm going to do is make these a little bit longer. I'm actually going to make the sides on this piece and I'm just going to put it in my brake and I'm going to bend those up. And that's going to add a little bit more rigidity to this charger shelf, and it's going to give me a position to weld the second charger shelf up on top. I love using aluminum. You could use steel if you wanted to do this project out of steel. I'm going to use aluminum and I'm actually going to cut 3 pieces. I made the tool holder shelf longer, and then I'm going to bend the sides up on it, and then I'm going to make the other shelf exactly that 23 inches, and I'm going to weld that in the middle, and then I'm going to weld that to a back piece which is going to get mounted to the wall. So after I laid out the base of the tool holder, I'm going to determine how wide I'm going to put these tools apart, and that's going to determine the slots, the dimensions between the slots. So if I put my tools together and I'm going to run that probably, if I get enough space between that, about 2 inches in between the tools. So if I set all my tools up in a row, I'm going to have about 1 inch overhang on the end. I'm going to have a 1 3/4 inch slot for the tool. I'm going to have a 2-inch spacing between the slots, and that's going to continue all along that piece. So I measured that originally from 23 inches wide, and I added 10 inches on each side that's going to be bent up for the sides. My charger shelf is going to be a straight 9 inches wide by 23 inches long. But I'm going to bend a 1/2 inch lip on the end of that shelf, again, to hold the chargers in place. I'm also going to measure and lay out my back piece, which everything is going to get welded to. So I know that it's going to be 23 inches wide, and I made the sides to my shelf 10 inches. So I'm going to make my back piece 10 inches by 23 inches. Now I'm going to take this over to my stomp shear and I'm going to cut this, but you could use a Sawzall, you could use, if you've got really strong hands, you could use a pair of tin snips, or even a cutoff wheel to cut this stuff. So now that I got my 3 major pieces cut, I've got my tool holder shelf, my top charger shelf, and the back piece cut. I will be bending the sides on the tool holder shelf, and I'll be putting a 1/2 inch lip on the charger shelf. But before I do that, I'm gonna punch my holes and cut my slots into the tool holder shelf. So I use my Rotex punch to punch the holes in here, and now I'm going to take it over to the bandsaw and actually cut these into slots. And those are going to be my slots that's going to hold my tools. Now I'm going to take this and the charger shelf over to the brake, and I'm going to bend the sides up on this, and I'm going to bend a 1/2 inch lip on the charger shelf. If you remember earlier on, I was talking about using 5052 aluminum for this project. I actually found a piece of 003 aluminum that I'm going to use for the top piece. 003 bends a lot easier than 5052, and I had a piece of this scrap laying around, so I thought I'd use it. One thing we're going to do before we take it over to the welder to TIG weld these together is we're going to remove that plastic film that's on these aluminum pieces. Even though this film is on there, there's still an oxide layer that's on the aluminum that has to be removed. And really the best practice for that is to take a stainless steel brush that's dedicated just to your aluminum and wire brush the sides or the areas which you're going to weld. That's going to help remove that oxide layer from the aluminum, and it's going to reduce some of the contamination you may see in the weld. Contamination will show up in the weld as little peppers or little specks inside the weld puddle. After I get done wire brushing my piece, I'll take some acetone and I'll wipe the piece off to remove any of that oxide dust that's still remaining on the piece where I brushed it. I use this little plunger can because then it puts just the right amount of acetone on my rag. And you'll be able to see easily how much it removes from the piece even though I wire brushed it. It's still pulling a good bit of that oxide dust off of the piece. For this project, I'm actually going to be utilizing a spool gun to tack these parts in place. I think a spool gun is kind of underused in the small frame Miller-Matic family and the Multimatics that have the ability to run spool guns. They're easy to hook up. The Miller-Matics and the Multimatics have an auto gun select, so as soon as you plug the spool gun into the machine, it selects spool gun from its microprocessor and you're ready to use the spool gun. There's no switches to put in or change. All you have to do on the front of the machine then is put your parameters in for your aluminum and you can go to welding. I'm going to use it on the Multimatic 220 and I'm going to be using it with Quick Tech. The Quick Tech in the Multimatic 220 allows me to use the spool gun and then immediately change over to the TIG torch flawlessly and seamlessly by just stepping on the pedal or pulling the trigger. Keep in mind, when you're going to use the spool gun, you got to change the gas on the MIG gas solenoid valve to 100% argon. Because I'm going to be using both the TIG and the MIG at the same time, I am going to use a dual regulator flow meter from Miller. I can hook up one argon tank to both solenoids. So now I can seamlessly change between the spool gun and the TIG without having to change bottles. The reason I'm tacking it with the spool gun is because the pieces are quite large and the material isn't that thick, so it's kind of cumbersome to try and hold the thing and try to TIG weld and tack it and make sure everything stays in place. If I MIG weld tack it, I can hold it and keep it in place much easier. Plus, sometimes if you're TIG welding, trying to tack with TIG welding, and maybe trying to add filler metal, sometimes that's kind of complicated because you're trying to hold your filler metal, your TIG torch, you're working the foot pedal, and ultimately sometimes the piece is going to move on you. If you try to TIG tack without filler metal, when you try to fuse those pieces together, especially even sometimes on thin material, you'll find that as you try to tack, sometimes the pieces want to separate a little bit instead of actually melt together. So this way I'm eliminating that problem by actually going to take the spool gun, I'm going to hit about 3 or 4 spots on here, and then I'm going to flip it over and TIG weld. So I've tacked with the spool gun and TIG welded the bottom tool holder shelf in place. It doesn't have to be TIG welded across the whole seam, but if you wanted to, you could. I just kind of stepped mine. And now I'm gonna tack weld the top shelf in. I'm just gonna set it on my marks. So now I finished welding my cordless tool holder together, and I need to decide where I'm going to put my power strips. What I'm going to do is mount it on the back, on the base, therefore the plug's up and out of the way, and it shouldn't interfere with pulling my batteries out. All in all, I think it worked out great. But wait. I have this one friend, yeah, I actually have one friend, but I have a friend who built one of these off the first set of plans that we did. And he doesn't like that the shelf wiggles or jiggles when he puts the tools on. Well, I've never had a problem with that, and I've never had a tool fall off of it. But I suggested that he cut a couple of spacers and just weld them in place to stiffen that up. But then I thought, why work that hard? You know, you've got filler metal, why not drill a 332 hole in the bottom shelf and the top shelf and slide the filler metal through that hole into the top shelf, leaving it a little bit long so that you could just spot weld it with the TIG welder on the top and bottom, and that would easily stiffen this up. So I'm going to revise mine and see how it works. So I drilled my holes on the bottom and the top shelf, slid my filler metal through it, poked it through the top side just a little bit more, I'd say about 1/8 of an inch, and all I'm going to do is fuse that to the top shelf. Then I'm going to cut this filler metal off on the bottom, flip the top shelf over, and weld the bottoms. Good to me. I hope some of the projects that I'm doing in my shop can inspire you or give you some ideas on what you can do in your own garage.